Well, good evening to all of you online, wherever you are tonight, and also to those watching on catch-up. Welcome to this, the third of our York Minster webinars, focusing on the global climate emergency. The webinars themselves are part of York Minster's celebration of CREATIONTIDE. That is the season which began on the 1st of September and will end on the feast of St. Francis of Assisi on the 4th of October. The issues we're looking at are very much in the public's consciousness at the moment, as we know both from what our Prime Minister has been saying this week in New York, and also as we approach the international COP26 conference in Glasgow, beginning at the end of October. These webinars are designed to help us reflect on the facts about climate change, but also particularly tonight to hear about the theology that informs our understanding and response to these issues. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Peter Collier. I'm part of the York Minster home team, and I'm one of the only two faces you will see tonight. The other is our speaker, the Reverend Dr. Peniel Rajkumar, and his theme is a theology for creation and climate. Peniel has recently been appointed as the global theologian for the USPG, and that has brought him and his family back to the UK, where he was ordained and where he obtained his doctorate in applied theology and ethics some years ago. Since then, he's held a number of academic teaching positions in Geneva and Bangalore, and has written extensively on Dalit theology, missiology, and interfaith dialogue. I believe he also has a passion for cricket, both playing as well as following. Now let's begin with a prayer. Glorious God, the whole creation proclaims your marvelous work. Increase in us a capacity to wonder and delight in it, that heaven's praise may echo in our hearts and our lives be spent as good stewards of the earth. Through Jesus Christ our Lord. Amen. It's now my pleasure to hand over to Peniel.
Good evening. It is indeed a joy and an honor for me to be part of this conversation this evening. And I thank York Minster for this opportunity. My theme for today is quite broad, a theology of creation and climate. And just to indicate that this is an exploratory exercise rather than a prescriptive one, I have taken the liberty of adding a question mark at the end of my title. Earlier this month, in an unprecedented move, Pope Francis, the Ecumenical Patriarch, and the Archbishop of Canterbury issued for the first time a joint message for the protection of creation. Recalling the biblical passage, choose life so that you and your children might live, they urge the need to address together the urgency of environmental sustainability, its impact on persistent poverty, and the importance of global cooperation. The message ended with the poignant reminder that our children's future and the future of our common hope depend on it. The climate crisis is a great moral wound of our times. The self-destructive nature of the moral and mortal spiral that we have designed for ourselves have vexed activists, artists, and even Christian theologians, even to the extent that a theologian like Moltmann had to digress from theology to satirical humor to highlight the ironic reality we inhabit. In his book, Hope in These Troubled Times, Moltmann recounts an imaginary conversation between two planets. The first planet asks the other, "So how are you?" The second answers, "Well, I'm sick. I've got Homo sapiens." To this, the second replies, "Oh, I know that one. I had it once, but don't worry. From my experience, I know that it will pass." We do not need either theologians or comedians reminding us once more that we are in the death of our own making, and that contrary to our thinking, we human beings have ensured that we will not have the last laugh. But what does theology have to do with this? We have been reminded by theologians like Thomas Aquinas that any error about creation also leads to an error about God. The failure to see the link between God and creation and to perceive creation apart from the innate goodness of God. It is not just a case of theology gone bad, but of theology gone disastrously wrong. That is perhaps the reason why there have been several attempts at developing eco-theologies, by which is usually meant an ecological critique of theology and a Christian theological critique of ecological destruction. What I'll seek to do today, as I reflect on a theology of creation and climate, are three things. First, I will lift up dominant themes that have been foundational in various eco-theologies. Second, I will explore the theological perspectives that have shaped these themes, taking into particular consideration the criticisms they have received. And third, I will go on to outline the contours of a theology of creation and climate that might be meaningful for our times. So what would be our starting point? A good starting point to identify dominant themes in Christian theological thinking probably comes from the joint message from earlier this month. The message highlights three salient points: the importance of sustainability, the impact on people living with poverty, and the imperative of cooperation, all of which have been the focus of theological attention. Let's turn to the first, the importance of sustainability. The theological focus on sustainability arose from what has been called the ecological complaint against Christianity, which reached its shrillest pitch in Lynn White's much-quoted essay, The Historical Roots of our Ecological Crisis. White argues that the shaping of modern Western science in a matrix of Christian theology that affirms human dominion or mastery over nature places a huge burden of guilt on Christianity. White's essay is much quoted, but also much contested, not the least for its extremely reductionist approach in tracing the roots of such a complex crisis to a singular cause. However, what Christian critiques of White could not deny is that Christianity, not by itself, but as understood and practiced by several of its followers, has been ecologically tainted. And this, they argued, is primarily due to its captivity to modern Western culture that has in many ways deified technology. In response to White's criticism, new theologies that emphasize stewardship as being antithetical to the dominion models of relating with nature were developed. They soon became the starting point for other theological models that emphasize sustainability. Despite their popularity and their persistent influence in the eco-practices of the churches, both the stewardship and the sustainability discourses have been critiqued. The primary criticism against these models is that they reinforce the human nature divide. They fail to offer a theological account of creation and foist a new anthropocentrism that offers managerial privilege to humans and reduces nature as the object of human management. As one critique points out, what makes stewards stewards in the first place is the responsibility for managing other person's chattels. And to view the world as God's chattel is to distort the personal relationship that God has with creation. However, the other criticism against this model comes from communities which are unduly affected by climate change, who maintain that the sustainability model is too linked to models of sustainable development that are primarily shaped by economic interests of modern-day capitalist empires. This lacuna has been recognized by Christian theologians who have seen and emphasized the need to hold sustainability arm in arm with social justice. Over the years, theologies of sustainability have strongly recognized their own moral bankruptcy, if not tempered by social justice. And this should take us to our next point, the impact on those living with poverty. The focus on the relationship between economic poverty and ecological destruction in Christian thinking has been influenced much by liberation theologies. In some ways, it came as a corrective to positions which, while being rightly critical of Christian anthropocentrism, yet did not take fully into account that in an economically divisive world of deadly disparities, one could not speak of the human, the anthropos, as one monolithic category. Christian ethicists have pointed out that the great moral and intellectual fault line of the ecological movement based on sustainability is the failure to recognize that while we may all be in this together, many are poisoned by the ecological crisis more than others. And usually these many tend to be those at the margins. The theological focus, or the broad theological focus on those living with poverty, broadly understood, ushered in many theological shifts. First of all, amidst the politics of dehumanization and defacement of climate change, many identity-specific theologies emerged, which gave a face to the amorphous category of the poor. These include the various ecofeminist theologies, the Pacific Islander theologies, the Dalit, Adivasi, and indigenous theologies, all of which recognize the particular experiences of those living with poverty as a starting point for their theology. These theologies recognized people's context as texts for theologizing. Elsa Thomas, a Mexican womanist theologian, writes that women's bodies can manifest themselves as sacred texts, setting out the stories to be read and reread and to generate liberating actions and attitudes. She goes on to say that women's lives enshrine a deep grammar whose morphology and syntax need to be learned for the sake of better human interrelationships. This turn to the many poor, broadly understood, also turned the focus on questions relating to what has been called the empire, which is the death-dealing accumulation of wealth due to one global financial system. The last World Mission Conference of the World Council of Churches held in Arusha, Tanzania, recognized this empire as that global imperial system which has made the financial market one of the idols of our time and has strengthened cultures of domination and discrimination. This focus on the empire gradually led to a focus on eschatology, end times, and particularly resulted in fascinating rereadings of the Bible, especially the book of Revelation. I will try and recount two examples. The first from an Indian theologian named George Zechariah. He explores the theme of the empire and eco-justice through the book of Revelation's vision of a new earth, marked by the strange absence of the sea. Pondering on this, Zechariah writes, how can we accept the absence of sea in the redeemed earth? And he goes on to interpret the disappearance of sea in the New Jerusalem as a critique of the political economy of the Roman Empire. According to him, the sea was the means for the Roman imperial power to plunder the colonized communities and their land. In the unjust imperial economy of Rome, everyone who had ships at sea grew rich by her wealth. For Babylon, sea was the primary agent for exercising its might and power to invade, plunder, destroy, and enslave communities. So the disappearance of the sea in the redeemed earth is not, according to Zechariah, the disappearance of water per se, but rather the alternative vision of the redeemed earth as antithetical to the imperial political economy of greed, commercialization, and accumulation. In a complementary reading, Barbara Rosing reads the book of Revelation as a book not about the end of the earth, but about the end of the empire. She adopts a different starting point from Zechariah's and sees the book of Revelation as a retelling of the Exodus story. According to Rosing, in Revelation's rereading of the Exodus story, the Roman Empire is scripted in the role of the predatory system analogous to ancient Egypt. Relying on the work of other biblical scholars, she points out that biblical writers aptly called Egypt the iron furnace or the iron smelter. Egypt, therefore, was the biblical archetype of the industrial society, burning, ceaseless in its demand for slave labor, the cheapest fuel of the ancient industrial machines, consuming until it is itself consumed. Therefore, for Rosing, John of Patmos applied the same biblical critique to Egypt to diagnose the sicknesses of the all-consuming Roman imperial economic system of his own day. She goes on to ask in her own time, if we wanted to apply the biblical critique of Egypt to the illness of climate change, we need to ask what manifestations of empire, analogous to Egypt or Rome, may pose comparable threats to the world and to God's people today. Probably this cartoon captures the best answer to Rosing's question. and reflects perhaps the worst threat of our times, the threat of denial. What the theological focus on the margins and the empire also helped us to focus on is the importance of listening to the voices of those violated by climate change, which face the threat of being suppressed. The Tongan theologian Sione Havia points out that in 50 years' time, if the projection is correct, many small island states will disappear under the rising sea level. But even before that happens, their voices and their interests are already drowning under the politics of climate change and the whitewash of dominant societies. This warning is an important one to bear in mind for us today and take seriously the voices of the marginalized. What positions like this help us to understand is that the theological focus on the margins can help us to discover the true nature of Christian theology as a theology of redemption, because it finds its resource and its source of liberation not in centers of power, but in the most unlikeliest of places, even death on a cross outside the city gates. And draw our attention to biblical stories where voices of victims of violation, like Abel, become the voices of accountability and ultimately the voice of God. Let's move on to the third point, the imperative of cooperation. Pope Francis makes it clear in his encyclical Laudato Si that given the complexity of the ecological crisis and its multiple causes, we need to realize that the solutions will not emerge from just one way of interpreting and transforming reality. We need to develop ways of working together with multiple partners. Many faith communities still struggle to work with others in partners in projects of common concern unless they have the lead role. We suffer from what has been called the problem of hostility, or the will to host always, which is the original sin of a triumphalist mindset. Now is the time to reinterpret Christian witness, as solidarity, and move from an attitude of hostility to an attitude of solidarity. And what such a witness or solidarity requires of us is not only working with people of other faiths and other communities, but also learning from people of other faiths and other communities. In many ways, the imperative of cooperation pushes us towards the practical. And now we come to the question of what, in the light of these three pillars of predominant Christian theologies of climate and creation, what would a theology of creation and climate look like at a time such as this? Of course, one cannot speak of eco-theologies in the singular, but given the reflections of the various trajectories above, what I'll try and outline very briefly is what the contours of one model of a global theology might look like from my own perspective. And as an organizing metaphor for my thinking, I would like to use the metaphor of a journey, which has been identified by a group of theologians as an appropriate metaphor to both appreciate the diversity in eco-theology while also addressing the underlying challenges. But my reasons for using this metaphor of the journey are entirely different. I use the metaphor of the journey because firstly, it helps us to address questions relating to our identity, both in relation to God and the creation. The earliest Christians were identified, after all, as people of the way. Therefore, an eco-theology relevant for our times would need to be a theology of identity through which we will bear a hopeful account both of our life in God and our life within creation, and how one connects with the other. And this theology of identity would essentially be Trinitarian in nature, because Jesus, the way, who is also the first fruits of the new creation, is the one who leads us into the promise of a redeemed and renewed life with God. The key to this God's identity for us were through the symbols of a rainbow and a burning bush, out of which we learned the liberating love of God. This theology of identity is also an identity that links our life in the Spirit to the Spirit of life, the green face of God, who permeates all life, groans through a suffering creation, and comforts, cajoles, and challenges the disciples of Christ, even to the extent of making them overturn their pockets and share their possessions so that true community can be built. The second way in which I would like to relate eco-theology to the metaphor of a journey is through the picture on the screen, to which I'll come shortly. An ecological theology in a globalized world like ours is essentially a story of connected stories. Climate change has revealed how our histories and future are inescapably interconnected. We have also heard how in the global politics of climate change, what is often suppressed are stories of the margins. In such a context, a relevant eco-theology will be one that will make space for a connection of stories and build a culture of we stories, connected stories. In this, the metaphor of the journey can help. And that is what takes me to the picture on the screen. This stone structure is a common roadside feature usually found at the entrance of villages in Tamil Nadu, the state from which I come. It is called a joumey, literally meaning a burden bearer. This is a load-bearing stone for travelers to rest their load as they walk from village to village. However, there is a story to each of these structures, because these structures are erected by the family of a woman who died during childbirth, as a testimony of someone who sought till her very end to bring life to this world. This joumey is a way of honoring a painful story. It also becomes a table where other stories are shared as people rest from their burdens of daily life. It symbolizes a theology where one finds strength for one's journey from the stories of the other. An eco-theology, therefore, that is relevant for our times has to be a theology where stories that are likely to be lost or remembered or pieced together to bring healing and wholeness to our communities on earth. And there is something Eucharistic in such theologies. Because as the Eucharist reminds us, what we learn at the Eucharist table is that in the economy of God's grace, crushed bodies and shed blood are not lost in meaninglessness, but sacramentally become the very means of God's grace and life. Thirdly, the metaphor of a journey also helps us to think of a theology that embodies a new way of living. The recent joint message reminds us of the urgency to repent, to turn around and head in the opposite direction. Connecting this to the symbol of the journey, I'm reminded of a book by the Japanese theologian Kosuke Koyama entitled 3 Mile an Hour God. In a context where technology had resulted in the rapidification of life and the commodification of persons, forgive me for the jargon, Koyama called for a new way of life that was not modeled after the speed of technology, but after the speed of God's love. According to Koyama, given that the average speed of human beings is 3 miles per hour, God, whom we know in Jesus, is actually a 3 mile an hour God. Through this God who is love, we learn that the speed of love is slow, gentle, and tender, and is at variance with the speed of the world. Indigenous theologians similarly speak of practices which are at radical variance with the standards of the world. Nancy Cardoso Pereira in Brazil speaks of the model of Sumak Kause that advocates the model of living well, but not better. Living well, but not better. A model of living that is marked by contentment, contemplation, and creativity. An eco-theology that makes a difference will embody an ethic that is different from the ethic of our time. Therefore, to conclude, what does all of this demand of us? At times such as this, of new and old pandemics, offers us a chance to rethink the doomsday machine we have built for ourselves, to use the words of the Indian author Arundhati Roy, as nothing could be worse than a return to normality. In such a context, the challenge for us to choose whether we will decide to stay in this world or choose to be part of making a different world is one that presents itself starkly before us. To be part of a different world, we need to hear again the words from the joint message of the Pope, the Ecumenical Patriarch, and the Archbishop of Canterbury. Now, in this moment, we have the opportunity to repent, to turn around in resolve and head in the opposite direction. The time to act is now. If not, the following words of warning from an ancient Chinese proverb might actually turn out to be poignantly true. If we do not change direction, we will end up where we are headed. Therefore, let us choose life so that not only us, but our children and the creation may live in all their fullness. Thank you.
Well, Peniel, thank you so much indeed for a fascinating lecture. I had no idea where we would be going on this journey tonight, and I've gone to places I've never been to before, and I'm very grateful for that. And I've got an awful lot to think about. I've been scribbling notes all through the talk, and I'm looking forward to going back over that, looking at some of the people that you've talked about and some of the references you gave us. It's absolutely fascinating. And I'm really appreciative, as I'm sure are all those who have been with us tonight and who will also see it on the catch-up. Next week's speaker is Professor Peter Scott, who will be reflecting on the planet which we inhabit and how the view of our place in the created, and how we view our place in the created universe. Peter Scott is the director of the Lincoln Theological Institute, a centre for advanced research in religion and society at the University of Manchester, and a member of the Centre of Theological Inquiry at Princeton in the States. Part of its inquiry is into astrobiology. Peter's the chair of the European Forum for the Study of Religion and the Environment and co-investigator for the Economic and Social Research Council funded project Life on the Breadline, Christianity, Poverty and Politics in the 21st Century City. It sounds like another fascinating evening. So as we come to the end, a final prayer. Tend the earth, care for God's creation, and bring forth the fruits of righteousness. Go in the peace of Christ. Thanks be to God.